Mute yourself.
Hey, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well today. We are so excited that you're here to join us on a little Broadreach virtual adventure. Megan is going to get started in just a minute, but I wanted to say hi. My name is Virginia. I'm one of the study abroad coordinators here, and we are pumped about our summer session with all of y'all. Just a reminder, since there are over 50 people in the session today, to go ahead and keep your mics muted. That will make sure that we can hear what's going on. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to throw them in the chat box, and Megan or I will kind of try to monitor that the best that we can. And if we need to, we'll get to the rest of them at the end of the presentation. We've kind of set up some time for that. You can also like raise your hand and clap and use all of those fun Zoom features I'm sure a lot of you have become familiar with over the past couple weeks. But I'm going to send it over to Megan. We're excited to have you here and hope you learned something new.
Guys, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Megan. I'm a marine biologist and an assistant scuba instructor, and I've worked with Broadreach for the past 2 summers as a marine science instructor. I've studied coral reefs around the world, Fiji, the Caribbean, Australia. I did my bachelor's at Oregon State University in marine science, and I did my master's at James Cook University in tropical marine biology and ecology. I love coral reefs. They're beautiful, complex ecosystems. So we're going to do a little intro to them today. And this background picture on my intro slide, I took on the Great Barrier Reef. So this is what a healthy coral reef looks like. Lots of coral, lots of life on top. See if I can get this. There we go. All right, just a brief summary about what we're going to go over today. So we're going to start talking about coral, how it's classified, soft versus hard corals, hard coral anatomy, and reproduction. And then we're going to jump into the ecology. So global distribution of coral reefs, what they need to grow, how they form, and zones that they create, competition among coral species, and niches and biodiversity. And finally, we're going to finish with the future of coral reefs. So why are they important, the threats they face, what we can do to protect them, and how we can dive deeper at home. So let's start off talking about coral. Before I begin, if you have a chat box open, type in whether you think coral is a plant or an animal. A lot of people have heard of corals, but are not sure exactly what a coral is. Nice. Lots of animals, people got it. Yeah, I got a couple plants in there and they live really closely with the plant, but coral is an animal. Awesome, guys. So coral is part of a group of animals called Cnidaria. The C is silent. And think of your jellyfish, your anemones, your box jellies, all the things that can sting you. So corals are stinging animals. And they are related to anemones. So they're in this little group called Anthozoa with anemones, which is what's pictured here. So cnidarians come in 2 main body forms. They can be polyps, so they live on the bottom of the ocean, their mouth and their tentacles point up towards the sky. Or they can be medusa. This is probably the one you're a bit more familiar with. Think your jellyfish. Their mouth and tentacles are pointed towards the floor, and they're gonna swim through the water column. Corals are polyps, and they're actually a collection of polyps all living together to form a coral colony. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So corals, they sting you, and they are polyps. So we have 2 main categories of corals. We have soft coral and hard coral. Soft corals, these are our octocorals. So octo means 8. They have tentacles in multiples of 8. And they're soft. So if you go over them and you waft your hand over it, it's gonna move, and that's how you know it's a soft coral. Then we have our hard corals. So these are our reef building corals. They're hexacorals, so they have their tentacles in multiples of 6. Hexa means 6. And they're hard corals because they make this calcium carbonate skeleton underneath themselves. So in this picture, we have the live coral tissue growing on top. And inside, we can actually see its hard calcium carbonate skeleton. I took this picture in Fiji. I think a storm cut this colony in half, but I think it's really cool because you can actually see that hard structure inside. So we're going to focus on these hard corals today because they're the ones building the reef structure. They are the trees of this coral reef ecosystem. So let's take a little bit of a closer look. So remember, we talked that corals are polyps. So here is our little coral polyp, and they're a colony of polyps all living together, and they're linked together through this calcium carbonate skeleton. So if we look at a single polyp, it has a mouth in the center of it. Each polyp has one opening. This opening is used for feeding, pooping, and reproduction. So it's an all-in-one. I like to call it a mouth butt. So whatever goes in comes out the same way. Around their mouths, they have tentacles, and within these tentacles, they have nematocysts, which is a fancy term for stinging cells. So this is what they're using to catch their prey, which is little plankton in the water column. However, this plankton they catch is only 10% of their food source. Where does the other 90% come from? So they live symbiotically or together with an algae called zooxanthellae. It's really fun to say, zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae, they're little algae friends that live inside the coral's tissue. The coral give the algae a home, and in return, the algae give the coral food as they photosynthesize. So the algae is taking light and turning it into energy, and the photosynthetic byproducts, so like glucose, is being fed to the coral. So the coral gets most of its food from these little algae friends, and it also gets its color from them. So if we look at this little coral polyp, if you look at the tentacles, you can see coral tissue is actually clear, and it's their little zooxanthellae that's giving them their color. If a coral gets stressed, say from hot temperature, it will kick out its little algae friends, and you'll leave the transparent tissue with the white skeleton underneath. This is what coral bleaching is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so we know what corals are. We can kind of see how they live together in a colony. Let's talk about how they reproduce. So corals are awesome because they can do two types of reproduction. They can do sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, this is how we make new coral babies. So one night a year for a few minutes, all the corals in the area are going to spawn at one time. So that means they're going to release all of their eggs and their sperm out into the water column. And then fertilization is going to be in the water. So the egg and sperm will come together and it's going to form a little coral larvae. So think like kind of like a little tadpole that's going to drift in the water column for a few days to a few weeks until it finds a nice hard surface to settle on. It's going to settle on that surface and turn into a polyp. And that polyp is going to start to grow a coral colony. And they do this. So here we see their eggs being released. They can do this in two different ways. So this is their asexual reproduction, which means that they are cloning themselves to grow the colony bigger. So two ways they can do this is they can do fission. So one polyp is just going to split in half and make two new polyps. Whereas they could also do budding, where one polyp is going to grow out of the side of an existing polyp. So this is how we go from a single polyp to many polyps all living and working together as a coral colony, a single organism. They can also do a third type of asexual reproduction called fragmentation. So if a piece of a coral breaks off from the bigger colony, if it finds a nice hard place to settle, it can actually start to grow a whole new coral colony. Which is pretty fantastic. So we've discussed corals. Now let's talk about how they actually build coral reefs. So we're going to start with where we find coral reefs. So globally, coral reefs are distributed around the equator between about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. The conditions in these waters are ideal for coral growth. What are these conditions? So we think of the tropics, we think about that nice warm water. That's a big reason why we want to go and visit them. The corals like this warm water too. So corals like a very specific temperature of water, about between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 to 30 degrees Celsius for those of you overseas. So like this nice warm water, they like shallow water. So remember, their little algae friends use light to photosynthesize and feed them. So they need to be in shallow water so they can get that light for their zooxanthellae. They need nutrient-low waters. So nutrients are things made of nitrogen and phosphorus, and they're really good for algal growth. So algae use nutrients to grow, but on coral reefs, we want to limit that growth. So we want a little bit of algal growth, but not too much, because if we get too much algae, it's actually going to outcompete coral and start to push it out of the ecosystem. So we want to make sure we have low nutrient levels. And finally, we need calcium and carbonate. Remember, we said that corals build their skeletons with calcium and carbonate. So we need those building blocks in the water column for the corals to use. I have a question. How much food is from symbiosis and how much is through their mouth from plankton? Yeah, great. So 90% is coming from that zooxanthellae and about 10% is coming from their active feeding. So generally during the day, it's the zooxanthellae that are photosynthesizing because that's when it's light out. So that's how the coral's getting its food. And then at night, when there's no light, that's when you'll see the coral polyps come out and start to actively feed. Great question.
So I have a question, Megan, if you can hear me.
It looks like she might be frozen for just a second.
Well, if not, that's quite impressive.
I would think so too. I was going to say, go ahead and ask your question. We have a couple other marine biologists on the chat that might be able to answer your question.
No, I was just curious because I saw. Is it just you now on the WebEx with me?
No, there's everybody else is still
Okay.
here. It's probably
Okay.
just showing the speaker.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because I read an article the other day about a great explorer's son has just gone down to the deepest depths of the ocean, down in the Pacific. And I was just wondering what you knew about what they had found down there. And why are they going there? And why is that harder than going to the moon?
That's a great question. Do we have any marine biologists that want to chime in while we wait for Megan to rejoin us?
I do apologize. Can save that one for the end.
We'll add some questions about some deep sea exploration and creatures. I'll put that in the chat as a reminder.
But what I found out was that actually that they had discovered that large mammals could actually exist at those pressures at that kind of level. It wasn't just small creatures. And that's what fascinates me.
Yeah, and it looks like Katie Nichols, who is actually our speaker on Friday, an awesome marine biologist, is telling us that the depths of the ocean are deeper than Mount Everest, and so there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the pressure.
I didn't read that.
Yeah. So lots of the ocean is definitely unexplored.
But yeah, no, it's just such a fascinating world to explore. I think we learn so much. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
Technology that we can actually, rather than looking outwards as we have done, which we should still do, but actually looking at what's below us is so important.
It's a great point. I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and throw Megan's presentation up on our screen if you all would like.
I'm back.
Oh, she's back. Perfect timing.
I'm so sorry.
It's all good.
All right, give me one moment. Let's bring this presentation back up. My internet failed me for a second there.
I think we're all pretty used to the ins and outs of internet world these days, right?
Yeah. Alrighty. Okay, I think we left off right here on building reefs. So we have our corals, we have our parameters for growth. How are they actually building the reef? So Imagine an island that's just coming up out of the water. And it has this nice little rocky area that hasn't been touched yet in the shallow water. And a neighboring island, the coral spawn and a little coral larvae comes down and settles on the reefs of this new island. And it starts to metamorphosize and grow into a coral polyp, and then a coral colony. Lots of coral colonies will eventually begin to settle in this area and start to grow up. And then as parts of the colony die, little bits of sand and sediment is going to fill in the leftover calcium carbonate skeleton. And then this is going to be cemented together by something called crustose coralline algae, which is a red algae, but it looks pink and it acts to cement the reef together. So we're getting leftover bits of coral skeleton, sediment, and crustose coralline algae that are basically building the foundation of the reef and allowing other organisms to come and settle on it. So it's like an actively growing ecosystem that's growing up and out over time. And it's the hard corals that are building this structure. So as a reef grows out from an island, we get different environments within the reef structure. So we'll start up on the beach, and that will lead down to a reef flat, usually a really shallow area of water where seagrasses grow. Seagrasses are great as little nursery areas for coral reef fish that are little babies. They're not ready to live on the big reef structure yet. And then as we go out to the reef crest, we'll get some small pools and channels with some smaller colonies of coral. And then when we hit the reef crest and go down the reef slope, this is like where the major action of the reef is happening. You've got lots of different colonies of corals all living together. And there's different microenvironments that are created within the reef structure that's good for different types of coral. So corals come in all sorts of shapes and sizes: branching coral, boulder coral, flower coral, massive coral. And these different morphologies create this complex 3D environment. So up on the reef crest, this is where our branching corals do really well. Branching corals are quite fast growing for corals, and by fast, I mean about 8 inches or 20 centimeters a year, which is the max growth rate of corals. So they're super slow growing animals, but these guys happen to do it a little bit better. So they can take advantage of those optimal light conditions near the top of the reef. As we go down the reef slope, this is where we're going to find a lot of boulder corals. We have our maize corals, our brain corals, really solid corals. And so they're able to withstand the wave energy that's going to be breaking on the reef. And near the reef base, we can find plate corals. So these guys have large surface areas, so they can take advantage of the lower light conditions. This is by no means a hard and fast rule. You can find all of these morphologies all over the reef, depending on the depth, the light conditions, the wave energy. But I'm just showing you that we get like different mini coral communities within the reef structure, and these can be utilized by different organisms. So a fun thing I want to talk about that happens among corals and also between corals and algae and between corals and sponges, but we're going to focus on coral and coral competition. So on the reef, space is limited. A healthy reef has 100% coral cover, which means there's only so much space for colonies to settle and grow. So what happens are these little mini slow motion battles on the reef where corals are vying for space to be able to grow bigger. So we can actually see 2 plate corals here that have started to grow into one another. And you see this white line down the center of them. This is called no man's land. This is just dead coral skeleton, and it's delineating where one colony ends and the other begins. So corals have different weaponry, we can say, to compete with other corals. The first one is shading. So we can actually see these 2 top plate corals are shading the coral underneath. What this is doing is blocking the light from that lower coral, making it harder for their zooxanthellae to photosynthesize. Therefore, they get less food and they have a slower growth rate. So they're trying to slow the growth or block the growth of other corals so that they themselves can get bigger. And that means more babies. The bigger a coral is, the more reproductive output it has. Another thing they can do is they have sweeper tentacles that are like little stinging tentacles, and they come out and zap the corals next to them if they're getting too close. They're like, back off, this is my space. And finally, the most dramatic maybe of these different types of strategies is digestive filaments, where they're going to directly eat the coral that's coming into its space. So you can see this boulder coral is actually eating the branching coral next to it. Again, this isn't going to kill the whole coral. It's just going to kill parts of it, but it's reducing the growth of the other corals so that the coral that's winning the competition can get bigger. Is there a limit to how big a single coral can get? They can get really big. I've seen boulder corals bigger than me, and it takes them hundreds of years to grow this big. I don't know if there's a limit to it. That's a great question. Let me look that up and get back to you on that one. We'll postmark it. But from my experience, they're going to keep growing until they're either outcompeted or something breaks them or hurts them. All right, so we got all these corals building the city of the coral reef, and this is supporting lots of species. So the corals are the foundation species. They create and define the habitat that everything else uses to live. And all the other organisms on the reef have developed a very specific niche. What is a niche? A niche is the organism's role in the environment. So what it eats it, how it reproduces, where it lives. And each little species have developed its own role. So it doesn't directly compete with other species. So for example, these beautiful butterfly fish pictured in this photo are coral eaters on the reef. And butterfly fish have developed very specific diets. So one butterfly fish will feed on one specific type of coral, while another butterfly fish will feed on another specific type of coral. So therefore, they're both eating coral, but they're not directly competing with each other for that resource. And because corals are so diverse and have so many different morphologies, there's lots of different hiding places and feeding options that are available to lots of species. So we can get many, many species in quite a small area. So coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet it is estimated that they support about a quarter, 25% of ocean species rely on coral reefs for survival. That's massive for such a small area to have such a large impact. So biodiversity means the amount of species in an area. We relate the tropical rainforest as a very biodiverse ecosystem. Coral reefs are the rainforests of the sea, and coral is the trees. And if we lose the coral, we're going to lose that ecosystem and many of those animals that rely on it, which is why coral is so important. So let's get more into that. We've talked about why it's important to the ocean habitats, and it's also important to us. So over 500 million people rely on coral reefs as a source of food and income. Think particularly tropical island nations. So most of their protein is actually coming from the fish that they're taking from their coral reefs around the island. And if we also think about these areas, their income comes, a huge part of their income comes from tourism. You know, we want to go down, visit those nice warm waters, see the beautiful reefs, and that brings a lot of money into the area. For example, in the Caribbean, 25 million visit the area a year and bring $35 billion to the area, which is about 14% of its gross domestic product. So these ecosystems are really important economically as well as nutritionally. They also provide shore protection. So it acts as a buffer to wave action as waves approach the shore. They're going to break over the reef before they reach the shoreline. So this helps reduce rates of coastal erosion. So the rate at which the shoreline is breaking away is going to be less. And it also protects coastal development during times like hurricanes and cyclones, because the reef is going to take a big brunt of that wave energy before it actually reaches the shore. And they're important for medicine. So coral reefs have been called pharmacies of the sea. We can utilize corals and other coral reef organisms in medicine and the creation of treatments. So one example of this is the sea hare. My brother asked me to put a picture of this on here for you. It's a giant sea slug, and they're called sea hares because they have these little receptors on top of them that look like bunny ears. And these guys have really large neural pathways. So they're being used in the study of treatments for Alzheimer's disease, because we can actually see how those nerve networks are connected together. Another example are sponges. A compound was taken for sponges and used to create a treatment for HIV. So these guys have massive medical potential, and much of it is left untapped. So coral reefs, they're amazing, they're important, and they are under threat. So 80% of coral cover in the Caribbean, coral cover has decreased 80% since the 1980s. So there's only about 20% of the original coral cover left in the Caribbean. Additionally, 70% of the world's coral reefs are either threatened, destroyed, or damaged. Coral reefs are in crisis, and there's numerous reasons for this, and arguably the biggest one is climate change. So climate change is happening due to the amount of carbon dioxide we are releasing into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide traps heat within the atmosphere, and the ocean is a great absorber of heat. So much of that heat is being absorbed into the ocean, and much of that excess carbon dioxide is being absorbed into the ocean. And this is having two big effects. It's raising temperature and it's changing ocean chemistry. So here's a graph of sea surface temperatures around Australia. And what it's showing is that since the 1980s, the sea surface temperature has been increasing and it continues to increase. Now remember, we talked about corals liking warm water between about 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. However, if the water gets too warm, which is what we're seeing now, the coral becomes stressed and it kicks out its zooxanthellae and it bleaches. Now, if conditions return to normal within a few days, they will be able to reuptake their zooxanthellae and survive. But if the temperature remains too high, they remain stressed, they remain bleached, they starve to death. I was in Australia during 2016 when they experienced the massive bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was really devastating. The other issue that we're facing is ocean acidification, which is probably a term you've heard before, but what does it mean? So because carbon dioxide is being absorbed into the ocean, it's changing chemistry. And don't freak out if you don't understand chemistry, that's okay. What I'm going to show you here is that with carbon dioxide in the water, it reacts with the water and free carbonate ions to form bicarbonate. Corals need those free carbonate ions to build their calcium carbonate skeleton. But if it's turned into bicarbonate, they can no longer use that form to grow. So what we're seeing is less carbonate, and corals and other shell-building organisms like snails are having weaker shells and are more slowly growing because they can't get enough of this material to actually grow strong and big. And this increases their risk of predation and storm breakage because they don't have that hard structure they need to protect themselves. Yes, so I have a question. Do zooxanthellae give coral its color? Yes, zooxanthellae give coral its color, and different species of coral have different groups of zooxanthellae that live inside them, which is how you get corals of all different colors, depending on what community of zooxanthellae is in them. Great question. Other threats, so there's a starfish called the crown of thorns starfish. It's a really cool looking starfish. They're massive. They can have 20 legs and lots of big spikes on them. And they're not an issue in the Caribbean, but they are around Australia and Fiji and that area. They're voracious coral predators, so they like to eat coral. And a few of them on a reef is fine, but about every decade or so, we get an outbreak. So we get hundreds of these sea stars covering reefs, and they basically decimate huge areas of reef by eating it all very quickly. A natural predator to these crown of thorns is something called a giant triton, which is a giant marine snail, and it will eat the crown of thorns starfish. Unfortunately, the giant triton has been over-harvested, so many of them have been removed from the population, so their reproductive potential has decreased. And this has affected their ability to predate on the crown of thorns. So because there's not so many tritons, they can't help to buffer this issue of crown of thorns outbreaks. And overharvesting is also a big issue with fisheries, and there's going to be a presentation on fisheries next week that I recommend listening to. And another issue, pollution. There are lots of different types of pollution. Two big ones. The first one shown here, it's called sedimentation. So this is when dirt, mud, sand washes off of waterways. It's brought up through coastal development or the digging of shipping lanes. And so there's a lot of stuff, some suspended in the water column. So this blocks light so that the coral gets less light for their little algae friends. And it can also directly smother coral. So if it settles on top of the coral, it can essentially bury it and kill it. And the other big type of pollution is marine debris, trash in the ocean. This is a huge issue. I have seen sea turtles wrapped in fishing line, sea lions wrapped up in plastic wrap. I have picked up a piece of trash from every single reef I've ever dove. And it's bad for the animals because they can accidentally eat it, which will block their digestive tract. And they can also get entangled in it, which is going to impede their ability to move and feed. Great question. How do we sort out plastic? That's a big, that's a big question. I'm going to touch a little bit on that at the end here. But basically reducing our plastic use. So we know they're important. We know they're under threat. What can we do to help them? So all these pictures I've taken from previous Broadreach trips, and I really hope you get the chance to go on your own trip. The first thing is education. You just being here is awesome. Understanding corals, reefs, what's happening to them, why they're important, is the first step in anything. And that's why I love being an educator. Because once you understand, you can do something about it and you can teach others as well. And the next thing is legislation. So on the marine biology voyage, we do an activity where I come up with an imaginary island and we build a network of marine protected areas around it. Marine protected areas are areas that are like national parks in the ocean. So they set up a boundary and they limit what can happen within the area. So maybe no fishing, no diving, scientific research only. And this is basically giving an area of ocean a buffer system so it reduces the amount of human activity so the ecosystem can recover and rebalance itself. So in 2016, the largest marine protected area in the world was implemented around Hawaii. And supporting this kind of legislation and climate legislation like the Paris Climate Accord is really important for the future. And while many of you may be still too young to vote, please vote when you can. The ocean needs your voice and the world needs your voice. And finally, we can do restoration. So this photo was taken off the island of Saba on a marine biology voyage. And I mentioned the cool thing, lots of cool things about coral, but one is that it can regrow from a small fragment of itself. So we've taken this idea and used it to help reefs. So we set up these things called coral nurseries, where we grow little bits of corals. So that's what we're doing here. And you clean off like algae or anything that's going to prevent coral growth. And then once the coral is ready, we're going to take it and plant it on the reef, just like flowers in a garden. And this is going to help reefs recover more quickly from disturbances such as bleaching events or big storms. So if you are interested in learning more and getting more involved, some things I would recommend. In the Broadreach newsletter, there's instructions for all of these activities. But I would make a coral reef cake because you get to bake a cake and make it like a coral reef and then eat it, which is awesome. We also have coral Play-Doh polyps, so you can make your own little polyp out of Play-Doh and make a colony by sticking all those polyps together. You're definitely never too old to play with Play-Doh. We also have spawning globes and coral growth dice game. So you can get more involved just doing these activities at home. Things you can do in your own life. Decrease your carbon emissions is a big one. This is things like using alternative forms of transportation, biking, carpooling. An easy one is turning off lights while you're not using them, just flipping a switch. Supporting renewable energy like solar, or supporting sustainable businesses like secondhand clothing stores. Refraining from using single-use plastics. This is a big one. I always have a reusable water bottle with me. It comes with me everywhere. Refraining from using straws and plastic utensils, bringing your own reusable bags to the grocery store. This is how we can reduce our plastic usage, and also picking up trash that you see around is also really helpful so it doesn't end up in our waterways. You can eat sustainable seafood. This is going to help with your over-harvesting issue. And if you go to seafoodwatch.org, it's a great resource for seafood that is good to eat and seafood you should avoid. Something I did in between my bachelor's and master's is I volunteered in an aquarium. This is a great environment to learn more, to be able to teach others. And if you're interested in a career in this field, it's a perfect way to get your foot in the door. And when you finally do get to see these beautiful reefs, please be conscious as you're snorkeling and diving. Refrain from touching the reef with your hands or standing on the reef. We just want to let the coral be and reduce its stress. And finally, if you're going to go do anything after this, please go watch the documentary Chasing Coral if you haven't already. It's an amazing documentary. Goes more in depth to the biology of corals and what's actually happening with the bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef and around the world and how they're documenting those changes. Other cool ocean documentaries are Blue Planet, Oceans, Shark. Just generally learning about the ocean is great. And on Friday, we're going to have Katie Nichols talking about invertebrates. I love invertebrates. I will definitely be there. And Mary Dinsmore is going to talk about island ecology and coral bleaching. So we touched on coral bleaching today, but she's going to go more in depth to that science. So definitely check that out as well. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something. I hope it was interesting. And I'll take a quick look at your questions and see if I can answer anything else for you guys.
Hey, Megan, I copied some of the questions that came up, so they should all be collected right there at the bottom for you.
Yes, a sponge, it was a compound from a sponge that was used for that HIV research. I know what the compound is, but not off the top of my head. So if you're interested in that, I can get you more information on that one. Do nurseries mess up the biodiversity at all? That's an interesting question. I think the big thing with coral nurseries is making sure your coral fragments are from colonies that already exist on your coral reef, on the coral reef you're trying to help. Because you don't know how bringing outside coral colonies and possibly different genetics or competitive species could affect your biodiversity. How do you attach a coral fragment? I haven't been very involved in the direct outplanting of corals, but I know there's a certain kind of like tacky glue that you can use to stick it to the reef, and once it's secure, it will begin to grow. And how much damage is caused by tourism? So I originally had tourism in this talk, but I wanted to talk more about climate change. Tourism does have an impact if it's done irresponsibly. So some things you can do to be a responsible tourist is to wear reef-safe sunscreen. So chemical sunscreens have something called oxybenzone and avobenzone in them that have been shown to be directly toxic to corals, and they induce bleaching in them. So using a natural sunscreen like zinc oxide is a great alternative. Another issue is inexperienced people touching organisms, kicking organisms. So being really conscientious of where you are in the water and trying to avoid touching coral as best you can is really helpful. But it has effects, but I think there are other ones like pollution and climate change that are having greater issues right now. Let's see.
Does anybody have any other questions? You could like raise a hand or throw a question in the chat. Cool. Well, Megan and I will stick around for maybe a little bit longer if anybody has extra things that they want to go over. But we're really excited you were here, Megan. That was so awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was fun.
Hopefully everybody learned something. Throw something you learned in the chat. I'd love to see what you all took away from the presentation. And I'll also go ahead and put links to our speaker for Friday. Katie Nichols is going to be sharing about invertebrates. And then next week, Island Ecology with Mary. So I'll put those signups in the chat box along with registration to get all of those activities like the documentaries that Megan mentioned or the like how-tos about how to make a coral reef cake and stuff like that so that you can get all tuned in. But if you need anything else, we'll reach out and we will connect with you. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. One last thing, Megan. You know, just one question, just one final question. Just tell me one random fact that you have that's going to wow me,
Okay, I got one.
as usual.
Sea cucumbers live on coral reefs. Sea cucumbers look like a massive cucumber. And what they do when they're scared is that they eviscerate or they poop out their internal organs. And it looks like something, and they leave them for the predator to eat, and then they scooch away, and then they regrow all of their internal anatomy again, which is super weird and cool.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay.
That's one of my favorites.
I'll love you and leave you on that. Well done. That was a good day.
Thank you.
That's the thing today.
I can type up some answers to these questions. Someone asked about how sediment pollution is being fixed. It's a good question. That's a lot about coastal development and the development of shipping lanes and where you're developing the coastline and those shipping lanes, and trying to be sure you're as far away from surrounding coral reefs as possible, I think. But that's going into like planning coastal development, which is an area you can get into.
We also had a question about some of the best ways to raise your voice in your community to share about the issues of corals.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think. I guess my biggest one was getting involved in an aquarium, because that's what I did. You can start your own ocean group, especially if you're landlocked and you have friends that are into the environment. Start an ocean club at your school and start raising awareness there. That's a great place to start. Or making changes if you're in an office, making small changes in that office space and explaining why. You know, now we're using reusable cups instead of plastic water bottles because we're trying to reduce our plastic waste for the environment. So making those little changes in your life and sharing that with your community and your friends is a great way to raise your voice.
Rick also had a question about the canals in Venice getting cleared up, maybe because of the impacts of COVID and less CO2 and nitrogen dioxide. Do you have any thoughts on how quickly coral reefs can be restored?
Yeah, so it's great that the amount of carbon emissions have been decreased during this time. The big thing is that we need to keep this trend, not permanent, but we need to keep the trend of lower carbon emissions. Corals are extremely slow growing and slowly evolving, which is why we're so worried about them, because we're changing the conditions in the water quite rapidly in terms of an evolutionary time. We've sped up the rate super fast. So the ability of corals to actually adapt and acclimatize to that is what we're questioning. So with the studies of making corals more resilient to climate change, we're actually looking at their algae, the zooxanthellae that lives inside them, because that has a really fast generation time. So if we can make our algae more heat resistant, maybe potentially we can help the corals become more heat resistant, because it's quicker to change the genetics of the algae than it is to change the genetics of the coral. But we really want to reduce carbon emissions overall. Great. I don't have a specific time frame though. Do corals get diseases? Yes, they get lots of diseases. And we're not helping that, especially with the amount of waste that we're putting in the water. So there's things called black band disease, yellow band disease, white spot disease, and they all affect different corals of different morphologies. But it's basically bacteria and fungus, same things that affect us, that get in the coral and start infecting it and killing the tissue. Good question. Anyone have anything else pressing?
Cool. Well, this has all been recorded, and so Broadreach will be uploading this to our website, and we'll let you know on our social media channels how you can rewatch and comment and post and share with anyone who was unable to join us today. But we're excited you're here, and we hope we'll see you either Friday or one of our weeks in the future.
Thanks so much, guys. Have an
Thanks,
amazing rest of your
Megan.
day.